It's very interesting to think about this idea of inconsistency via his father that Ramanujan is talking about, because like his father, Ramanujan also straddled various different diverse worlds itself. If one thinks about Ramanujan's worlds, one would be thinking about a bilingual poet uh, mm, who is negotiating between the world of Kannada, world of Sanskrit, and world of English itself, like multiple levels of understanding that are there in these various different languages. A poet, again a bilingual poet or an English poet, who draws his entire material, whose entire worldview from India, southern India, and is in Chicago writing about it. The other so-called diverse worlds can be thought of in terms of trying to bring together folk tales or oral culture into print itself, and the various complications and the politics of it that comes with it, that like should oral tales be written down itself? Will it not defy its existence in uh, as a tale that grows with every transmission, every translation, through every telling itself? By writing it down, are we trying to pin it down, restrict it, and put an authoritative version of it out? So those diverse and different and complex worlds are also part of Ramanujan's life itself, much like his father, who was traversing these very opposite worlds itself. So one can see that inconsistency that probably Westerners find difficult to comprehend about India seems to define the Indian in that sense. Now, let's think about, and he pushes us to think about the rest of the characteristics. The second one being the distinction between the outside, inside, self, and the non-self. Another related characteristic, he tells us, seems to preoccupy observers. So these characteristics have been given to Indians, given to define Indian by the observers. We have already said that inconsistency, as he gives us an example of his father, or an example that he in the previous section, in this section he talks about in terms of the use of the word karma itself, that how karma has various diverse contextual meanings in different parts of India. There is also another characteristic that is there, and he says this is the one that he's talking about. The distinction is this, and he quotes first Henry Kissinger, and then he quotes Sudhir Kakkar through Naipaul, who says that Indians have a very complicated relationship about the insider-outsider. I'm going to read Naipaul here via Kakkar. Generally, among Indians, there seems to be a different relationship to outside reality compared to the one met with in India. In India, it is closer to a certain stage in childhood when outer objects did not have a separate, independent existence, but were intimately tied or related to the self and its affective states. This reminds him of Henry Kissinger. This is invoked by Kissinger also. Kissinger, who says, and then you can see that these observers of India have tried to pitch India in some kind of a developmental trajectory where we have not reached somewhere in that sense. That's why we are almost in a stage of childhood, according to Naipaul, Or as Kissinger would say, cultures which escaped the early impact of Newtonian thinking have retained the essentially pre-Newtonian view that the world is completely internal to the observer. Empirical reality has a much different significance for many of the new countries than for the West, because in a certain sense they never went through the process of discovering it. So, you can see that there is almost no outside in that sense, everything is internal in the internal to the observer. So, we have not somewhere the idea is that we have lagged behind, because the Newtonian revolution did not take place for us, our societies did not go through it. So, that is why we probably have not, and that is why we are stuck in this stage of childhood. And then he quotes Foster's Passage to India. This is a quote that is you will find many times in discourses about India. And again, this is about the inside and outside, but here an addition of what is animal and human is also added by Foster. Going up to hang her cloak, this is from Passage to India, we are talking about Mrs. Moore. She found the tip of the peg was occupied by a small wasp. She had known that this wasp was or his relatives by song. They were not as English wasps, but had long yellow legs which hung down behind when they flew. Perhaps he mistook the peg for a branch. No Indian animal has any sense of interior. Bats, rats, birds, insects will soon nest inside the house as out. It is to them normal growth of the eternal jungle which alternately produces houses, trees, houses, trees. There he clung asleep while jackals bayed their desire and mingled with the percussion of drums. So, there is a certain kind of a animistic presence in the Indian world itself. The non-distinction between inside and outside, or distinction between the self and the non-self. One other commentator praises Indians for not being hung up on an objectivity that distinguishes the self from the non-self. Some have found it to be praiseworthy, some have found it to be a kind of a roadblock in the developmental trajectory. So, one can see that Indians apparently have a inability to distinguish between the self and the non-self, the inside and the outside. They mostly think everything as an expression of their inside, or the outside does not have that kind of an impact. Whereas the West has a clear distinction between what is inside, what is outside, who is the self and what is a non-self, where is the boundary of the human end and where does the boundary of the non-human begin. So, that kind of a rigid distinction seems to be missing in the Indian psyche itself. So, we have now talked about two of the major characteristics as observed by observers: inconsistency of the Indian, and the second one is the inability to distinguish between the self and the non-self. The third one is this insistence of Indian mind on the particular rather than the universe. So, for this he juxtaposes Kant and Manu. He quotes from Manu. At the time of marriage, during dalliance, when life is in danger, when the loss of property is threatened, and for the sake of a Brahmana, Manu declared, whenever the death of a man in any of the four castes would be occasioned by true evidence, falsehood was never better than truth. He also tells us of certain other instances from Manu. Three of them he quotes here. A Kshatriya having defamed a Brahmana shall be fined 100 panas. A Vaishya 150 or 200, a Shudra shall suffer corporal punishment. even truth-telling, he says, unconditional imperative. An untruth spoken by a people under the influence of anger, excessive joy, fear, pain, grief, by infants, by very old men, by persons laboring under a delusion, by being under influence of drink, or by madmen, does not cause the speaker to fall, as we shall say, is a venial or a mortal sin. So, what he does through these three quotes is to show that how Manu is talking about specific instances, that in a specific instance one will be paying a Kshatriya from a specific caste would be paying, a person from a specific caste would be paying a specific kind of a fine, whereas the people from other caste having committed the same kind of crime would pay different amounts or suffer different consequences. As he says, even like there are conditions of truth telling and also questions of death or killing itself, that it by itself does not become a sinful act. And he says, contrast all of this with Kant's well-known formulation of his imperative, act as if the maxim of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature. Moral judgments are universalizable, says one of the Western commentators. What it means is that the Western society or Western thinking thinks of morality in terms of universal order. One rule that is applicable across the board for everyone. In contrast to that, to be moral for Manu is to particularize, to ask who did what, to whom, and when. So, it should not be a rule that is applied across the board without factoring in people's position, the context in which the action took place, or to whom it was affecting, the person who was affected, the person who caused it, the context within which it was caused, and the situations that led to causing it seem to be the Indian way of thinking. So, Indians constantly are thinking in terms of particulars is what he is trying to tell us, and therefore, the Indian way seems to be at odds with the Western one, which seem to insist on universal ideals. And he goes on to argue that is there any system to this particularism? Indian philosophers do not seem to make synoptic systems like Hegel or Kant's even. Indian thinkers are not interested in making these grand systems itself. We are very familiar with the Kantian critiques itself, Kant's laws, Kant's understandings and worldviews about ethics, or the Hegelian system itself. And you will see that there is a long line of Western thinkers who seem to be very interested in making systems of sorts, grand systems. The Indians don't seem to have a penchant for that. He argues that Indians speak of a toolbox rather than grand system from which they use one or the other without much show of logic, anything that goes into their bricolage, if we recollect Levi-Strauss here. So, in that way, these three differences or these three characteristics are the features of Indian way, and he tries to theorize it, and he says it may be helpful to think about this, and he tries to now theorize that what does it mean, this Western versus Indian way of looking at the world. He says and he borrows from grammar because he comes from a linguistics background. So, he says there are two kind of grammatical rules, one is the context free, one is the context sensitive. And he says cultures also work in that way. So, he says that predominantly in cultures like India, the context sensitive kind of rule is preferred formulation, whereas in the Western one, it is context free. So, we have context free and context sensitive. So, within this kind of a dialectic is what India operates or any society operates between this push and pull of context free and context sensitive. He says that it's not as if like a society entirely is context free or entirely is context sensitive. That societies can be context predominantly though be defined as either context free or context sensitive. He says India belongs to the latter. India is a context sensitive culture itself, and we have already seen examples of it, and he gives us much more examples in these following sections from 4th section onwards. The first example that he gives is of dharma. How is dharma used in various different parts of the country, various different contexts of the country? He says, let's look at dharma itself. We have already talked about how karma comes in different avatars. He says, Bodhayana enumerates the aberrant practices peculiar to Brahmins of the north and Brahmins of those of south. So, dharma is not the same for the same caste across India. There is a difference between south and the north on 5 points. We shall describe the practices of the south: to eat with a person not having received Brahminical initiation, to eat with one's wife, to eat food prepared the previous day, to marry the daughter of the maternal uncle or paternal uncle, and for the north to sell wool, to drink spirit, to traffic in animals with 2 rows of teeth, to take a profession of arms, to make sea voyages. These are the 5 different ways that dharma is defined for Brahmins of the north and the south. And then he says, add to this the view of the right or the wrong behavior, the ethical views of ashrama dharma, swadharma, swabhava, apadharma, all of this is there. Then he says, I know of no Hindu discussion of values which reads like Plato's symposium, in which discussion of beauty, which asks the initiate not to rest content with beauty in one embodiment, but to be drawn onwards from the physical to moral beauty, to the beauty of laws and mores, and to all science and learning, and thus to escape the mean slavery of particular case. So he says that what we get to see is that there is no universal definition of, or one definition or a homogeneous idea about dharma itself, if you just take that word. Then he moves on to give us more examples. He says, if you look at, for example, literary texts, he says no Indian text comes without a context. So, for example, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata open with episodes that tell you why and under what circumstances they were composed. Every such story is encased in a meta story, and within the tale, one tale is the context for another. Within it, not only does the outer frame story motivate the inner sub story, the inner story illuminates the outer as well. And we have discussed about Kadambari, Ramayana itself, Love and Kush come and sing Ramayana in front of Ram, and that's how Ram actually knows about them as his own children, right? If you think about, for example, he talks about the Pandava brothers and the story of Nala and Damayanti in that way, that is also there. And then we have the story of Mahabharata itself, right? The way it is conceived itself. And then he also tells us of Indian astrological texts like Nadi Shastra. They relate to text, and an extreme case of this is Nadi Shastra, which offers you your personal history. A friend of mine consulted the expert about himself and his past and future. After enough rupees had been exchanged, the expert brought out an old palm leaf manuscript in which archaic verses mention his full name, age, birthplace, and suddenly at this point the listener is crossing his legs and he should uncross them. So you see a wonderful meta narrative that is built out of this context, text, the temporality that is being breached, and all that comes because of this kind of merging of text and context. So context then holds a very important part of the way text is thought about. And he goes on to give us examples from Tamil poetry, where without the frames of the poem, like for example, knowing the genre of Hakam or love poetry, the landscape or the mood, one cannot understand the poem in all its richness. If one looks at more and more examples of it, the other examples can be thought of in terms of space-time, which also are not universal categories in India. If you look at space-time, he says the Kantian imperatives are in India not uniform and neutral, but have properties, specific densities that affect those who dwell in them. For example, we have certain auspicious times of the day and not so auspicious times, Rahu Kalam for example. Certain units of time, yugas, breed certain kind of maladies. Politics and religions like Kali Yuga, and which is given as a like this word holds so many meanings itself. The Kali Yuga has come whenever you see some kind of a dishonesty being performed, some kind of a treachery, some kind of a immoral activities that are carried out. So people would say, oh, Kali Yuga has arrived, that's why this is happening, and Kali Yuga. And if you see catastrophic events also, then people also invoke that, oh, it's Kali Yuga, what else do you expect? And this is what is going to happen. So one can see that space-time itself also has a context in India. It's not that time is homogeneous or time is empty in terms of as we think of it in terms of calendar time or the clock time in that sense. So if you look at it, time then also has its own density. Time also is thought of in terms of its specificities. So as hour, months, seasons, years, aeons have their own properties, the arts also depend on them. So that's why we have ragas that are for different times of the day, and ragas that can be sung at a certain specific time. Like the Tamil poem, genres and moods are associated and placed in hours of the day and times of the season. Even musical instruments have their caste properties. A veena, no less than an icon of the god, has to be made by a particular caste or a family after observing certain austerities made on a specific day. So you see that kind of context specific nature of it, which also pervades Indian understanding of jati and all other, for example, philosophical understanding or medical understandings also, as he details to us. So what we get to see then is that Indian system itself is a very context specific culture, and that's what he tries to tell us. He concludes by telling us that the most important and accessible model of a context sensitive system is of course the grammar of a language. The grammar is the central mode of thinking in many Hindu texts. So he says what Euclid is to European thought, Panini is to the Indian, even Kama Sutra is literally a grammar of love. So in that sense, we are thinking in terms of those grammars itself. That's what he tries to tell us. In such a world, systems of meanings are elicited by context, by the nature of the listener also. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, you have those three words, da, da, da. When the gods given to pleasure hear it, they hear it as the first syllable of Damayata, that is control. The anti-gods, given as they are to cruelty, hear it as Dayadavaram, to be compassionate. When the humans given to greed hear it as Datta, give to others. So it depends on who is hearing, who is saying, and in what context are they hearing it. So therefore, one can think about the context specific nature of of the Indian society in that sense.